Welcome to Conversations That Matter. As always, I'm joined by correspondent Mike McNish. Mike, who's our guest today?
Stu, today we have David Keane. He's the executive director of a new organization in BC, the BC LNG Alliance. Interesting organization. This is an alliance of competitors. We hear lots about LNG being, part of the future for our economy in British Columbia. There are 14 potential projects currently. Many in the industry believe that 2 to 4 is probably a reasonable number to expect actually being developed and being economically viable.
But the number of those projects that are joining in on this alliance is growing.
That's right. It started with 4. Some of the major ones like Shell and Petronas. Many people think Petronas might be first out of the gate. They've come together because they've realized lessons from other resource industry companies that failed on some level. And they're trying to figure out how can we manage these massive public consultations? How can we manage the relationships with the First Nations? How can we potentially share pipelines? A whole host of things that they see as being common areas of interest, even though they're competitors. And David Keane, of course, worked for BG Gas, which is one of the world leading producers of liquefied natural gas. They're in 24 countries. He was head of government relations here in British Columbia. So he's got more than 30 years in this industry, perfectly situated to lead this alliance. It'll be really interesting to see how this unfolds.
One of the things that he pointed out, because they're working together, they can also work with the post-secondary education institutions to start to build the skilled labor force that's going to be needed for this
that's
industry.
Right, Stu. Yeah. That's right. They have identified that as being one of the major issues. Lack of skilled labor force. And this has been an issue that other resource companies have dealt with right across Canada. We're seeing more coming out of the BC government about making sure that the education system is calibrated for these jobs that we're going to need in the future. And they see this with the BC LNG Alliance as being a major priority to advocate for an education system here in BC that provides them the labor that they need. A big undertaking for sure.
Very interesting conversation at a crucial time in the development of this industry. Let's go to that conversation now. Welcome. Thanks for joining me. I think that this is a very interesting point in time when it comes to the discussion about LNG. There was the great enthusiasm around the initial embracing of the industry a couple of years ago, and now because it takes time, you hear people going, oh, we're missing the window of opportunity. Different investors are leaving the province because they say that this investment opportunity isn't worth it to them. Let's start by having you give me a little report card on where we're at right at the moment as far as LNG investment in British Columbia.
Well, Stu, thank you first of all very much for inviting me on. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the LNG industry in British Columbia is alive and well. If you look at our alliance, which is made now up of 7 members, it's growing. We started when I started back in the end of August. We had 4 original founding members, which were Shell, Chevron, BG, and Petronas. We have since added Woodfibre, AltaGas, and ExxonMobil. So we are growing the industry. I think these companies are very, very focused on developing an LNG industry in British Columbia and are very positive about doing that.
Why are they so enthusiastic? Because we now, of course, in British Columbia are starting to pay attention to world markets and saying, but the market's not going to be there. This is just, dreaming.
I wouldn't say it's dreaming. I think if you look at the market's going to be there. The demand in Asia Pacific is going to remain robust. It may be declining currently in China and elsewhere, but our forecasts are that it is actually going to grow over time. These are long-lived projects. They take a long time to come to fruition. So we're very positive about the demand. We think that British Columbia has a lot going for it in terms of developing an LNG industry. One, it's got a huge natural gas resource base. So that is very, very positive. It's got
like how huge is it? Like, That's a nice way to describe it, but
Oh,
how significant is...
I think it would take it would take clearly more than 100 years at current consumption levels to deplete your natural gas resources in British Columbia. And those are the proved reserves in British Columbia. So it's got an enormous resource base. It has a highly educated workforce. It has a great educational and healthcare system. So there's a lot going for British Columbia. And last but not least is its proximity to the Asian markets. Very close. It's about 5 to 7 days of transit time to get to the Asian markets.
The situation in China is changing. I was reading just recently that they've signed another agreement with Russia for the supply of natural gas. But that's not the entire market. How do you describe where the opportunities are?
Well, the Russian deal with China, I think, I'd like to just mention that briefly. I think that's a very positive sign for the LNG industry. I think that will actually help increase natural gas demand in China.
How so?
Because for the first time, other than having LNG imports, they will now have another source of natural gas coming into the country that will cause companies to want to switch from heavier hydrocarbons, whether it's coal or fuel oil, to natural gas. So I think it will start getting people thinking about increasing demand for natural gas, which will be beneficial for British Columbian LNG.
That brings up an interesting point. If they start to move to greater consumption of natural gas, what is the overall benefit as far as moving away from carbon-based fuels?
Well, for natural gas, natural gas has about 45% less of the greenhouse gas emissions than does coal. So the climate impacts will be enormous. I mean, it will reduce CO2 emissions in China, and a lot of those emissions ultimately blow to the west coast of North America. So it'll have a positive effect not only on China, but also on the west coast of the U.S. So I think it's very positive.
Of the 7 partners, how many of these projects over the next, let's say, 5 to 10 years have the likelihood of coming to production?
Well, of our 7 partners, all of them.
They're convinced that there is that significant of an opportunity, and if so, then what does that represent as far as investment in British Columbia?
They do think there's that much of an opportunity. In terms of investment, if you look at the large-scale facilities, which are out of our 7 members, there's 5 of them, and if you just take a conservative investment number of about $10 billion, that's $50 billion for plants. And then you have another between $7 to $9 billion for the pipelines. And then their upstream investments, which will be somewhere between $5 and $8 or $9 billion. So there's a tremendous amount of economic opportunity for the province if all of these facilities get built.
Well, the Shell project is projected at being a $40 billion investment. Do I have that correct?
That's over the life of the entire project. I'm talking about just the initial investments of building the plants.
Shell's in partnership with a group from Japan, Korea, and China. So obviously they know that market. What stage are we at with that project? Because it appears to be the biggest one at the forefront of development.
I can't specifically talk about individual projects, but I can say it is well advanced. They have done a tremendous amount of work in terms of working with their constituents, their partners, with the city of Kitimat, and their pipeline partners as well. So I think they're in a very good place.
How many jobs does it represent, particularly in Kitimat?
Well, during construction, they're saying it could be between 4,000, I think initially, up to about 7,500 during construction.
So, and what's the economic, direct tax benefit to the District of Kitimat?
In terms of taxes and what these facilities will be paying, all of the facilities, they all will be paying the LNG tax. They'll be paying carbon tax. They'll be buying carbon offsets. They'll be paying PST and GST, as well as municipal taxes. They'll be paying corporate income taxes, both federally and provincially, and then payroll taxes.
Like the production of aluminum, LNG requires a tremendous amount of electricity. How important is the building of Site C if we want to be able to develop all of these LNG projects?
Well, that's a very good question. In terms of the facilities themselves, I think all of the, particularly the large-scale facilities, will be using natural gas to drive their turbines.
For the most part.
They'll all be using natural gas to drive the turbines to do the liquefaction. Again, that's something that will operate 365 days a year, every year. So that absolutely has to continue to operate. What they're talking about in terms of other demand is for the ancillary services within the facility. So it's air conditioning, lights, and things like that. And it's not an insignificant number. It's between 180 to 200 megawatts of ancillary power requirements. Now, in terms of Site C, if you wanted to power all of these facilities on just electric drives, you'd probably have to build another 2 or 3 Site Cs to be able to meet the demand for all the proposed projects.
There's this sense, especially when we heard that Petronas was looking at, depending on what the tax regime looked like, how that was going to affect their investment decision, and there was considerable outcry, I guess, about the way that the province was structuring the tax regime around LNG, that maybe pressure was being put on the provincial government to give things away. And yet when I looked at the BC Hydro deal, I didn't get that sense at all. What is the level of commitment within the industry to ensure that they are strong financial contributors to the province?
I think there's a high level of commitment. Again, when you look at all of the taxes that these projects will pay, the LNG tax, there's no other jurisdiction in the world that charges a special LNG tax. Carbon taxes, having to buy carbon offsets in addition to a carbon tax. And then with the PST, GST, corporate income taxes and the like, there will be a significant economic uplift for the province and for the federal government as well, and municipalities, through the development of these facilities. And I think Petronas put in its EA filing, its environmental assessment filing, that they would be contributing more than $1 billion a year to all levels of government in terms of taxes and royalties, and that's without the LNG tax.
So when you add those in, the LNG tax, the carbon offsets, and so on, does that not then start to affect the bottom line, and how does it affect the decision-making process that goes into deciding, okay, we've brought it now to that crucial moment, do we go with this or do we not? Like, are all those taxes pushing us to that point where an international organization like Shell might go, no, I think we're not going to do that one in British Columbia, we're going to go here?
Well, all of these companies have global opportunities. Mm-hmm. And when they start looking at their investment opportunities, they'll look at what's the rate of return on the project and its net present value, and does that meet our internal requirements? If it does, then it will go into their project funnel, and it gets stacked up with all the other opportunities that they have within that funnel. And so then it depends on how it shakes out amongst the other global opportunities. So if you're looking at developing LNG facilities in the Gulf Coast of the United States, or in East Africa, or in Russia, or in the Middle East, it'll get stacked against those. And so I think all of these companies are concerned about the economic returns for their projects. They're also very, very concerned that, and want to make sure that British Columbians do in fact get a fair return for the sale of their natural resources.
And how close are we to that breaking point in that decision process?
Well, as I've said in a number of speeches that I've given and interviews I've done in the past, we need to have certainty, we need to have clarity around the fiscal structure, we need to have certainty and clarity around the greenhouse gas target intensity factors that are being set. So I think it still makes this look very attractive, but we have to be careful that we're not going to be putting too much on the back of these plants, because if we do, then they simply will go elsewhere.
You talk about certainty. One of the other components that's involved in that is, of course, First Nations. And in light of the Silcotin decision that came down this summer, how does that affect the process?
Well, all of our proponents are working very, very closely with their First Nations partners. I don't think the Silcotin decision will negatively impact any of our projects. I think that they're working to develop impact benefits agreements with their First Nations that will, in fact, have long-term sustainable benefits that are real benefits for the First Nations, and something that will last them for decades to come. So I think actually the decision by the Supreme Court of Canada doesn't negatively impact our projects at all.
Another question that comes to mind is, okay, we start bringing these projects on stream. Do we have the trained workforce here in British Columbia to do this work?
Well, we're in the process of working with the government, with the Premier's government, and I've been directly involved with the LNG working group that she created back in September 2013. I'm now on the executive committee of that group as our organized labor and the pipelines, along with First Nations. Part of what we want to do is identify the skills that are going to be required. So we look at when a project declares a final investment decision. That's day 0. Then on day 1, what skills do you need? Day 30, what do you need? Day 365, day 1000, day 2000. So you develop your bell curve in terms of skills. How many welders will you need on day 365? How many electricians, carpenters, pipe fitters? And then look to the province to provide us with data in terms of what do we have available today, and then what do we need to do in order to make sure that we train British Columbians to get the jobs that they need, that they should be getting and should be first in line for.
What at this point has been the response to the building of more pipelines, particularly in the north? We take a look at the Northern Gateway pipeline project, and there is, as we all know, a vocal group that says no way. What's the climate about building natural gas pipelines?
It's been very positive. The pipelines that are looking at, or pipeline companies that are looking at building these facilities across the province have, I think, done quite a lot of very positive work with local communities and local First Nation communities to be able to work with them in terms of access and being able to build them.
The one area of opposition that you may face in a growing symphony of protest would be about hydraulic fracturing, or fracking as it's commonly known. It's an important part of the business, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Maybe you can give me a little bit of a rundown on exactly what it is, how hydraulic fracturing works, because I think it's one of these things people go, oh yeah, fracking, I'm against that.
Well, it's hydraulic fracturing, first of all, has been around for decades. And if you're consuming natural gas in British Columbia today, or probably a lot of Canada, or a lot of North America, then you're consuming natural gas that has been from shale. So and shale is really just rock that has hydrocarbons in it. And in order to get the hydrocarbons out, you have to literally break the rock up. And the way you do that is by forcing water into it at high pressure, which breaks the rock. So that's hydraulic fracturing. In terms of what's done to protect environment and safety is you have proper cementing and proper use of casings, steel casings, which goes down through any aquifers or whatever, and it's completely sealed. Again, when you get down 3,000 meters and you're going sideways another 2,000 meters, you're well below any groundwater. And again, you're fracturing impermeable rock, and you know how much you're fracturing, how far the fractures extend. Again, it's impermeable rock, so the only way you can get out of it is to break it up.
Mm-hmm. Where do you get the water to do this?
Well, typically, or actually what a lot of companies are looking at today are looking at alternatives to fresh water, looking at saline aquifers, uses of gray water rather than drinking water or fresh water. So that's where it comes from. But it should also be pointed out, currently, the use by the oil and gas industry in British Columbia of water for hydraulically fracturing wells is less than 1%. I think it's about 0.075%.
Well, I know that Geoscience BC has dedicated a considerable amount of their research to identifying available water supplies for hydraulic fracturing. And is it true that there is an abundant supply of usable water?
Yes, there is. Again, the industry is only using about 0.075% of the available water supply. And even when it expands to supply the gas for these facilities, it's hard to see how you would expand even more than maybe 1.25%.
Huh. Does it concern you at all that as we start to move towards the development of LNG, that there seems to be a a growing number of voices that are starting to say, oh, well, hang on a second, maybe we better not do this because there might be an environmental impact to this.
Well, I think what I prefer to focus on are the positives, and I think if you look at the average British Columbian, I think the average person, the guys and women that get up and go to work every day, that I hate to use the term because it's overused, soccer moms and soccer dads, but the people that are in this province that say the economy is important, we recognize that. The environment's important, we also recognize that in protecting the environment. I think we have to, as an industry, be able to work to help educate and inform the people throughout the province that are saying, look, I want to be supportive, just give me a reason to be supportive. So that's really what we want to try and do, is develop our educational programs, our informational programs, so that we can help people understand how LNG is produced, how hydraulic fracturing works, and what all of the companies do in terms of working to protect the environment and working to protect health and safety, not only of the workers, but also health and safety of the communities in which they operate. And I think that's extremely important. Then you show the economic benefits that will accrue to not only the province, but also to the people in the province. I think we'll get plenty of support from the people that are on the street going, I think the economy is important, I just need a reason to support LNG. We want to give it to them.
Do you believe that LNG has quite possibly the lead role in the economic future of British Columbia once we get 10, 15 years out from now?
I absolutely do. When you look at just one of these large-scale facilities, if they make a positive final investment decision, that will be the single largest investment ever in British Columbia. And I think this will be something that will be impactful in a positive way for generations of British Columbians. So it's not just for people that are in the job industry or looking for jobs today, but it's for those kids that are in college today. It's also for their kids that are in high school or in junior high, and even their children. So this will be a multi-generational opportunity that will provide tremendous economic benefits for all of British Columbia.
And to the provincial bottom line?
Absolutely. It's going to be a very positive implication for the provincial bottom line.
Well, I'm looking at the future moving forward and seeing this as being like the opportunity that maybe British Columbia has been waiting for a long time, because so many of our resource-based industries have been declining over the years. And you know, I wish you luck in moving forward, and I hope as many of these projects as possible can get completed, because I think that it has a tremendous opportunity to be beneficial to the province of British Columbia. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. Appreciate it.